Friedrich Nietzsche, das Lesen neu lesen.
The text makes you ask, why is it that I think this? And what that does for me is something extremely important. It reverses the normal relationship between reader and text. We normally think that what we do is interpret a text. What I'm saying here, no, in fact, the text is the analyst, and we are the analysand. We are the people being analyzed by the text. How to read Nietzsche is becoming, probably always should have been, the major question, for two reasons. One is the range of interpretations of Nietzsche is extraordinary. It goes from far left to far right to non-political, totally political. You name it, somebody has come up with an interpretation of some kind and so forth. So it's the first question of what is it about Nietzsche's text that permits such a wide range of interpretations? The second reason it's important has to do with something that David Allison, an American philosopher, once wrote in a book called Reading the New Nietzsche. And what he said there was that Nietzsche writes for you. That is, one's experience of reading Nietzsche is that he is writing for you, not at you, but for you, precisely you. Which means, and many of us have had this experience, that when people read Nietzsche, they have some sense of a kind of personal encounter with it. It means negative or positive. And those two things together raise the general question of what is it about Nietzsche's text which permits this? Now, the analysis of that has to go through, I think, the fact that Nietzsche was, after all, a trained classical philologist, and a philologist with a training which is almost non-existent today. That is, he knew the material backwards and forwards, and most especially he knew rhetoric, and he knew classical rhetoric, and he used it. He taught courses on it. We can have in the Kritische Gesamtausgabe, the first volumes of it are his lecture courses on rhetoric. They are very important to read. And in those one of the things about classical rhetoric is that it places an enormous emphasis upon the fact that a text, a speech, is to be shaped in relationship to the particular audience at whom it's directed. And this for me means that when one's reading Nietzsche, one needs first of all to ask oneself, at whom is this particular book, this particular passage directed? Who is the intended audience for it? And there you get a very interesting passage in the Nachlass, which is relevant to understanding that. And this is 10 commandments, zu Lehre vom Stil, the teaching of style, that he sends to Du Salome as a letter at one point. And there are 10 commandments as to how to read. And among them, he says, in what you write, everything, every comma, every punctuation, every hesitation, every word, everything is there for a purpose. Now, if you take that seriously, that is, if you think that Nietzsche took that seriously in what he published, that every comma, every word, every hesitation, so forth, was there for a purpose, that means that every text of Nietzsche is specifically crafted with an audience and with a purpose in mind. First task, then, is to figure out who is the audience and what is the purpose. One of the consequences of thinking this way is enormously important because it refutes one of the standard things that are said about Nietzsche by people like, say, Brian Leiter. But it's not just Leiter, Maud Marie Clark, a whole bunch of people do this. And basically it consists in saying, well, Nietzsche is very interesting, but unfortunately sometimes he's just out of control. He's rhetorically over the top. He goes too far. And what readers like that try to do, therefore, is to say, let's get rid of the exaggerated stuff in Nietzsche, and let's reformulate Nietzsche so that he looks like a good analytic philosopher, someone who would publish in the Philosophical Review, as my dear friend Alexander Nehamas did. If you take the material in the Lehre vom Stil seriously, that has to be an illegitimate move. It has to be incorrect to say that anything that Nietzsche published, at least, is rhetorically over the top or exaggerated. It's there for a purpose. And then one has to begin to ask, what is the particular purpose in a particular passage? And that makes the reading extremely, extremely difficult. Now, we can go later to some passages from Nietzsche where I think he does this. I've tried to write about this myself. But one of the, to jump to the end of this particular question, if Nietzsche writes for you, and for you, and for you, then he in fact writes for everybody, as in Zarathustra, a book for all, a book for none. But that means what? Does it mean that there's a correct reading of Nietzsche? If this reading is directed at you, but it's also at you, or at you, and what you, and you respond to it as people respond to. Footnote here. When one teaches Nietzsche, one always has the anxiety with an undergraduate that the undergraduate is going to say, wow, this is terrific, I love it. And you have to keep saying, no, you really don't understand it. You don't get it yet. You just think you understand it. It has to calm them down at that point. But to go back to where I was, if Nietzsche writes for you and for you and for you and for you, then what does this make of the question of is there a correct reading of Nietzsche? And here I think, and this is at least an argument that I've tried to make, the important thing to say is that when one reads Nietzsche and one thinks that one has understood it, either positively or negatively, the first thing one should do is to ask oneself, why is it that I want to think that this is what Nietzsche means? In other words, what is it about me that leads me to think that this is what Nietzsche means, whether I like it or not? What that means is that Nietzsche, in fact, induces a kind of self-critical quality in the reader. That Nietzsche, in fact, should lead you to ask yourself, what is it about you such that you want to respond in this particular way? And that means you are involved in making a critique of yourself, of your own understanding, because your own understanding will be an understanding which the text has permitted you to have, but which the text will in fact correct. And we were mentioning before that you were having the experience of reading Nietzsche and suddenly finding the second time or third or fourth time that you read Menschliches allzu Menschliches, that it was a different book. Well, it's a different book because your first understanding that you had was an understanding of a first reading, and you come back to it again and you have that first understanding in your head, but you also, the text makes you ask, why is it that I think this? And what that does for me is something extremely important. It reverses the normal relationship between reader and text. We normally think that what we do is interpret a text. What I'm saying here, no, in fact, the text is the analyst, and we are the analysand. We are the people being analyzed by the text, and the text is analyzing us. But to do that, we have to allow ourselves to be, in some sense, open to the text. Anybody who's had any experience in psychoanalysis knows, in fact, exactly what kind of process that is. So that's how I think, in general, Nietzsche's texts work. And for me, this explains in part why there's such a wide range of interpretation, why those interpretations are all, in some sense, potentially self-correcting. And it has one final consequence, which is a dangerous one. One of the standard things now said about Nietzsche is, such a shame that the Nazis took over Nietzsche. We now know, thanks to Walter Kaufmann, thanks to everybody else, that they got it wrong, they were incorrect, and so forth. If what I'm saying about Nietzsche is correct, that is, Nietzsche writes for you and for you and for you, then he also writes for Nazis. And it doesn't mean that the Nazi reading is correct any more than it means that my reading might be correct, but it does mean that the text has that possibility in it. And we know it actually, it was one of the two main texts that were taught at Nazi sort of ideology schools. Zarathustra was during the National Socialist period. So that's a danger, but it's there. And I thus reject, in fact, people who say that the Nazis got it wrong. They did, but they didn't get it wrong any more differently than I might get it wrong. And then the question is, will the text perform this act of self-criticism? What I wanted to do here is to discuss for a minute sort of the question. It follows on what we were saying before, the question of reading Nietzsche's aphorisms and in a more specific context. And let me start out by mentioning that people have discussed this, and one of the people who's discussed it, I think, very well, is Werner Danhauser, who talks about the importance of the aphorism in Nietzsche's work. And Danhauser says, and I'm quoting him, "It is not easy to determine when he is being quoted out of context, because it is not easy to see whether there is a context or what it is." And he goes on to say that the aphorism is a kind of counter to the treatise as a form of philosophizing. And he continues by saying, aphorisms, quote, and I'm quoting, broach problems rather than solve them. They're generalizations to be taken as stimulating insights rather than final truths. And the example he gives is a famous one, and this is the one I want to talk about briefly here, is the example he gives is, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Now, I take that because it's such a standard quote from Nietzsche. It comes up in the shirts for Gold's Gym, which is an exercise gym. It's what you can buy a shirt which says, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," and go out and lift weights. It even shows up in the beginning of a movie, Conan the Barbarian, with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Starts out with this quote from Nietzsche, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." Now, the aphorism, as Danhauser gives it, is, of course, a generalization, and you could find, he says, all sorts of counterexamples. The problem, to the degree that what he cites is the aphorism, of course, is not a final truth. But the problem is that Danhauser does not cite it correctly. The entire aphorism is, in italics, from the military school of life, no italics, dash, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Now, that's a very different aphorism. And the two parts of this, from the military school as Kriegsschule, resonates to the second part. What does it mean to speak from the military school of life? Especially as this aphorism becomes part of a military training, Nietzsche says, perhaps a training that's necessary to write a book like Twilight, where it occurs, which is a declaration of war. But Nietzsche says war here is a way of wounding oneself, to keep one from being too inward, too deep. Now, I don't want to finalize an interpretation or a reading, shall we say, of this, but I do want to say a number of things. One is, to understand the aphorism, you have to understand the resonances between the two parts. They interact with each other like counterpoint in music. Secondly, very importantly, this is a sentence which lends itself to being remembered the way Danhauser remembers it. Everybody cites it as whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Almost no one cites it as from the military, Kriegsschule, to the military school of life. What this means to me is part of recovering the whole involves remembering that one did not want to remember the whole. That is, you have to take into account that you are attracted to that whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger, and you forget that this is, in fact, limited to a particular kind of training which may or may not be appropriate to whatever you're doing at a particular time. Wanting to get it wrong is necessary for knowing that you want to get it wrong is necessary for being able ultimately to get it right. This is what Dr. Babbage has called consinity at one point in her reading. That is, how the parts go together like counterpoint or like in a musical fashion. It's a kind of unification of dissonant themes. Now, one could go on about this. I don't want to do this at too great length here, but if you take, for instance, now section 5 of the Morality as Anti-Nature section of Götz and Emerald, Twilight of the Idols, you find a very interesting thing as you go through it. The first part, the first several sentences of that aphorism are all done with the pronoun man, one. Given that one has grasped the sacrilege, one has there grasped something else, and so forth. In other words, the subject of the paragraph is not defined, it is one. That means that part of the paragraph appears to be open to everybody, no matter what their historical position. And you're asked, in effect, are you part of this one? Do you see yourself this way? And there's a whole set of use of conditional phrases here, given that and so forth. You come to understand yourself as part of this one. Now, he goes through that, and the one continues for 4 or 5 sentences, actually, and so forth. And then all of a sudden, he raises the question of what is the value of life? It leads into that. I'm not going to read the whole thing all the way through. One would have to occupy a position outside life. On the other hand, to know it as well as one, as many as all have lived it. And he then stops, puts a colon, and he moves to a second. He moves and he says, these are reasons enough to grasp that for us, für uns, this problem is an inaccessible problem. In other words, the whole set of problems which have been set up with the neutral noun, man, are now said to be inaccessible for us. Notice, first we have a general appeal, now we have a kind of small group appeal. The one yields to a we. And that wir, continues on for a couple of sentences and so forth, raising the question about what kind of life finds these understandings inaccessible. And then all of a sudden, just as we think, we're with Nietzsche here, we've got it, he suddenly says, there's a dash, I already gave the answer, declining, weakened, tired, and condemned life. The sudden intrusion from the I, notice man to wir to I, Nietzsche, says there's no help from Nietzsche. What he has to say, he said at the very beginning, but you missed it. In other words, the I forces you to go back and ask again the question, why is it that I found myself associated with this man and then even more tightly with this wir, and I was wrong both times. I made a mistake. What is it about me? I missed the tonic chord. I missed what made it. I have in fact condemned my own life. And this is again this critical relationship between the text, what the reader wants, and what the text makes available and requires of the reader that this does. You can find this in all sorts of other passages. If you go to the first essay of the Genealogy of Morals, you find that 9 out of 17 paragraphs begin with a Gedankenstrich, a thought stroke, a dash. In the Kaufman translation, he leaves out all the dashes. And one has to ask, what difference does it make? Now, the dash is in technical rhetoric called an aposiopesis, a word that means becoming silent. And it's a rhetorical device which indicates that something has not been made explicit. My favorite example of this is from Star Wars, where Darth Vader says, "I sense something, a presence I have not felt since." And after the since, of course, is what you are dying to know. At the beginning of these 9 sections, they seem to me to indicate that what follows is addressed to a particular person, hence that the text that follows in each of those sections is a response to a particular person. And in fact, in sections in 14 and 15, they are actual dialogues. There's a dialogue between 2 characters in each of them. Now, what difference does that make? If you take section 7, it's often taken as Nietzsche giving his sort of standard contrast between the noble and the base. Larry Hattab reads it this way, Brian Leiter reads it this way, and so forth. But if you take it as a response to somebody, what follows in 7, you have to ask who is it a response to. And I think with a little investigation, you can determine that it is a response to German anti-Semites. Because the passage talks about a priestly caste and a warrior class confronting each other, giving powerful physicality, a blühenden, rich health that overflows the selves, so forth, and comes strong, free, happy activity. It sounds like the masters. Now, if you take it as a response to German anti-Semites, they're likely to be reading this passage that starts out and says, "Yeah, that's us, the knights, the masters." But then you go on, and you find in the rest of the passage that these Jews who are contrasted with these masters, supposedly, give rise to the Sermon on the Mount. And in fact, it's the last part of the section is a paraphrase of a passage from the Gospel of Matthew. And then Nietzsche says, we know now who became heir to this Jewish revaluation. The people who become heir, that inherit the Jewish revaluation, are the Christian anti-Semites, who have been loving the first part and skipping the second. So even Christian anti-Semitism is itself consequent to the Jewish revaluation, and therefore calls itself into question. And the next section 8 begins with another dash. And he says, but don't you understand that? You don't have eyes for something which needed 2 millennia to achieve victory? 2 millennia. And what's there? These second millennia, which has given, is where we are now. In other words, what Nietzsche is saying is, you people who think yourself to be knights, masters, and so forth, are in fact just as much slavely moral as anyone else is, even though you want to think that you're not. So it becomes a kind of criticism at that point of people wanting to hold certain beliefs about themselves, not realizing, in fact, why they have those beliefs, where they come from. And again, it's this inducing of self-criticality. That's the kind of thing I think one finds in reading Nietzsche's texts. And one of the difficult things, of course, in doing this is that it means that reading any particular text becomes an enormously long process. It took me a long time to figure out the stuff about man, one, we, I. And I've written a couple of papers, in fact, just on that one paragraph of Twilight of the Idols. If you had to go through all of Nietzsche like that, it would take you a long time, but of course, that's what we have. I was looking for a thesis topic. I I was young. I didn't know much. It was the 1960s, when the 1960s were in the air. I first wanted to write a thesis on the concept of time in political thought. And I tried to do that for 6 months, and I realized I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know enough to do it. And I realized almost by accident that it might be the case that I would be able to write about what I wanted to write about, which I'll say what it is in just a second, if I wrote on Nietzsche. And what I wanted to write about was the way in which the past affects the present, and the way in which the hold of the past on the present can be changed or transformed or broken. It's fundamentally a problem in, if you want, the theory of revolution. It's fundamentally a problem in the theory of cultural revolution, an expression, by the way, which Nietzsche uses explicitly, cultural revolution. Hence my interests in Nietzsche from the very beginning were interests which had to do with the possibility of reading Nietzsche, not in some sense as an abstract philosopher, but as somebody who was centrally concerned with the world as we experience it, and the problems that that world presents to us, and what might be able to be done about it. Now, this was 1966. In English, nobody was reading Nietzsche in political science and political theory at that point, or almost nobody. The French were just beginning to read Nietzsche following the publication in 1961 of Heidegger's 2 volumes on Nietzsche. But in English, there was basically nothing. And when my book, the book I eventually wrote, came out in a second edition, I went back and looked at the bibliography, and there were, I think, 3 English language books on Nietzsche written since the Second World War, and I had read pretty much everything. There were some things coming out in German. There were some Habilitationsschriften, which were quite good, mainly around moral philosophy. But in English, there was nothing. So it was like a new territory. And in order to, in fact, be interested and write about what I wanted to write about in Nietzsche, I had to learn how to talk about all sorts of things, ranging from the Greeks to sociology to anthropology. This was the heyday of structuralism, to aesthetics and to politics and so forth. So from the very beginning, my concern with Nietzsche was Nietzsche as, in some sense, a practical philosopher. That is, Nietzsche being about how to deal with and respond to the world in which we live. The book that eventually came out of that is called Friedrich Nietzsche and the Politics of Transfiguration, Politik der Verwandlung, and it's a big book, now in its 3rd edition, which I'm pleased with. But it was, I think, the first book in English to take Nietzsche seriously as a subject in political theory, or for political thinking, I would say, and so forth. Since then, of course, we've found it's become a minor industry. I mean, you have all sorts of people in political theory writing about Nietzsche in one way or the other, though many of them really picking and choosing what they like in Nietzsche in manners which I'm not always entirely happy with. The question of can reading Nietzsche lead to a new philosophical form is an extremely big and extremely important question. The answer is, I think, yes, and the answer has to do with the fact that he is, I think, centrally concerned with what we have now come to call, following Pierre Hadot and other people, the art of living. That is, that one's life can be shaped in such a way so that it is not controlled by things which are not our own. Footnote here, notice that this is a contemporary interestingly different version of Kant's idea of autonomy, giving oneself one's own law. Not with the universalism that you find in Kant, but with, in fact, a kind of individuality found in each particular person. How does that to be attained? Well, in part, I think it goes back to what I was saying before about the ability to find one, to be able to be self-critical, to find oneself in reading Nietzsche, in the experience of coming to call oneself into question. The presumption in Nietzsche is that we are shaped by our past, individual and collective. Hence, by the way, the parallels that people have often found with Freud, because what Freud is telling us is that if you have a neurosis, it's because of something about your past. And Freud will eventually, of course, in Unbehagen in der Kultur, write about this on a collective basis. If we're shaped by our past, both individual and collective, the question is what can be done about that, how to break it. One must give oneself, as he says, a past from which one hopes to have descended. The most important passage for me in Nietzsche along these lines, and one I think which really sets the tone for all of his work, comes at the end of the third section of Nutz und Nachteil in der Historie für das Leben, the use and abuse of history for life, where he says we have to essentially replace our nature with a second nature and make that second nature become a first nature. A difficult task, he says, but which, however, has been achieved every so often, sometimes by accident and so forth. That is, what you have been can be transformed into what you could have been, and what you could have been can become what you were. And that will produce, in fact, a new way of being in the world. This is what I think he's pointing at in the 1886 preface to his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, a book which, in my reading, remains absolutely central to everything Nietzsche does, and all of it, not just the first 15 chapters, where he says, one must look at first at science from the optic of art, and art from the optic of life. One must look at Wissenschaft, and of course in German it has a much wider connotation than it does in English. This is a book about the wissenschaftliche understanding of the Greeks and of tragedy, but that is to be understood from the perspective, or the optic as he calls it, of the aesthetic, and that in turn to be understood from the perspective or the aesthetic of life. What he means by life there is hard to figure out exactly, but it really has to do with the manner in which one lives one's life, and therefore it refers back to something like an art of living. So I think, in fact, Nietzsche in that sense is an extremely practical philosopher, not in the sense that he tells you what to do, but in the sense that he forces you, or he can force you, or if it works, he will force you or lead you to change yourself. Now, can this be collective? That is a big question in Nietzsche. There are far more worries about the question of the collective in Nietzsche than most people think. If you look at the early writings, Schopenhauer, as an educator, is about the transformation of the self. Richard Wagner in Bayreuth is about the transformation of the group. Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music is about the transformation of a culture, a cultural revolution. That's what he's trying to do there. So that concern is there all the way through. Does he work it out? Well, yes. I mean, when you get to look at the first book of Zarathustra, what's it about? It's about social institutions. What's wrong with them? About, the academy, about the marketplace, about the economy, about schools, about priests, about religion, about women, about men. It's all critique of social institutions, often missed, but that's what's going on there. How do you attain that kind of collective transformation? We sort of understand the individual one, or we think we do. The collective transformation is, in The Birth of Tragedy, is held to take place by the means of a certain kind of aesthetic revaluation, characteristic or characterized by the musical qualities of tragedy. We can talk about that if you want. When you get to the end of his life, it's extremely complicated and interesting, because if you look at the last 14 to 17 letters that he writes, this is the period where he may have stepped over some kind of limit into what is called a Zusammenbruch. If you look at them, you will find that they are characterized universally by his intent to take up a purely political stance. I'm having the Bismarck and the Emperor and all anti-Semites shot. I am going to move to the Palazzo del Quirinale, which is the executive house in the Italian state. I'm ready to rule the world. Well, is this crazy or not? At one level, one reads it as megalomania. At another level, one can read it, I think, as this is Nietzsche saying this problem of collective transformation is in fact going to require much more direct action than I ever thought it was going to require. And it's going to take something like what I'm saying for it to happen. But he suddenly recognizes that in some sense the problem is bigger even than he thought it was, or the solution is more complex than he thought it was back in the 1870s, in the period of Birth of Tragedy. But I find Nietzsche therefore concerned throughout his life with this question of Verwandlung, both on an individual level, but on a collective level, and also on a cultural level. And in that sense, it's no accident, as I've said before, that he does in fact speak in a letter to Rode early on of the need for a kind of cultural revolution. A phrase, by the way, which recurs for the first time in Lenin, who speaks explicitly of a cultural revolution. And as a little interesting footnote here, Lenin had read The Birth of Tragedy. He owned a copy of it, and it's annotated. So, this has led me to be linked with people whom Alasdair MacIntyre called left Nietzscheans. There's some truth to that, though my version of left here is not precisely a sort of standard American, social democratic left. That's not Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche does say that he writes, he won't be understood for 200 years, that he writes for morgen and übermorgen, that he will be born posthumously. He has some sense that he's anticipating, and that what he's concerned with are developments inherent in the situation at the end of the 19th century, but which have not yet fully come into being. The most obvious example is when he says the next century will see wars the like of which no one has ever seen. That turns out to be true. But that means that, in fact, you have to read Nietzsche here in terms of a person whose understanding of the West is such that it can have produced the horrors of the 20th century, which means you're not reading him, in sort of the context of 1870, you're reading him in the context of 1945, or of later, in fact, and so forth. when, again, Walter Kaufmann seeks to excuse what Nietzsche says about war by saying, well, what he had in mind were just wars like the Franco-Prussian War and so forth. Now, if you actually go back and study the Franco-Prussian War, you will find out that it was much nastier than that. But that's not what he has in mind. What he has in mind are wars the like of which no one has ever seen. And he's quite explicit about that. That's the 20th century. André Malraux catches this at some point, and when Raymond Aron writes a book called The Century of Total War, what he means by total war is that we have moved in the 20th century into a political system where conflict involves entire populations and not just soldiers, where you have the wars for ruling the earth. And I have no way of understanding what what was going on with Nazism, with Soviet communism, with what's called American imperialism, and so forth, if those aren't wars for the domination of the earth, if those aren't conflicts for the domination of the earth. It is an attempt to spread a particular idea on a universal basis, and the conflict between those various ideas. And that's what bothers Nietzsche enormously, because each one of those people, Nietzsche realizes, is convinced that their particular idea of what should be universal is what is morally correct. And hence Nietzsche's anxieties about morality is that when you take that kind of universalism and universal imperial qualities, shall we say, of different kinds, and you moralize it, then you justify anything. And that's what has happened in the 20th century. It's a extremely interesting coincidence that my book here, The Politics Without Vision book, which is a study of really a 20th century thought, came out and at the same time as Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, where Pinker looks back in the 20th century and says, oh, things have been getting better and better and better. And I simply can't follow that. I don't understand how he can possibly say that. And I think he has to have he has to be looking at it with just one eye. But that's there. Yeah. You raised this interesting question of how my reading of Nietzsche affects my other work and my work in general. And the answer is that it actually has affected it, a great deal, in some sense, often in ways that I'm not completely aware of. I'll give you just an anecdote. I wrote a book on Rousseau called Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Politics of the Ordinary, which, of course, echoes the title of my first book, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Politics of Transfiguration. And one of the things I came to understand, in part through the influence of the work of Stanley Cavell, is that what I was talking about when I talked about Verwandlung, transfiguration, in the first book, had a great deal to do with what's meant by the ordinary, or the vulgar, or the commun in Rousseau. So that in fact the Rousseau book is interestingly a kind of sequel to the Nietzsche book, picking up many of the same themes. The anecdote which goes with this is that this book, the Rousseau book, was part of a series that was being published first by Sage and then by another publisher. And a friend of mine, Ben Barber, was supposed to write a book for the series on Nietzsche, and he was complaining he didn't have time, he didn't know how to do it. And I said, Ben, it's not very difficult. You just take my book on Rousseau, and everywhere it says Rousseau, you put Nietzsche, and you'll have a book on Nietzsche. And he actually never did it, but I wasn't entirely joking in doing that. The same has happened elsewhere. I mean, I've done a lot of work, for instance, on Hobbes, but my reading of Hobbes really is about the same question of transformation, of how a text becomes authoritative. And I've written 4 or 5 articles now on Hobbes. I'll probably write a little book at some point. It comes up there. Much of the reading that happens in this particular book here, which goes through not just Nietzsche, but also Kant, Max Weber, Freud, Lenin, Carl Schmitt, Martin Heidegger, Hannah Arendt. Again, all of those readings are shaped by an understanding which I have coming out of Nietzsche. And it's also led me back to do other things that might not seem interestingly obvious, but I've now written three articles on 19th century American literature, on Melville, on Mark Twain, and on Hawthorne, all of which are in fact picking up picking up Nietzschean themes. A little footnote here. I was therefore delighted to find, as I was doing the article on Mark Twain, that Nietzsche sends to his friend Overbeck on the occasion of his marriage as one of the wedding presents a copy in German of Mark Twain's Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and says, I much prefer his foolishnesses to our German sillinesses, or something like that. So Twain, Nietzsche read Twain and liked him, which doesn't surprise me. We know also from work that Thomas Brobier's done that we knew that Nietzsche read Emerson, which was very important. We know he probably read Walt Whitman at this point. So, those parallels actually turn out to have more, shall we say, a philological foundation than simply my wanting to find Nietzsche everywhere, which is not hard to do. I want to take us back here to Nietzsche's first book, a book which I've argued is, I think, absolutely essential to his life's work. I reject the division of Nietzsche into three stages, sometimes 4 stages, and so forth. I think the same themes are, in one way or another, pretty constant all the way through. But if you go to the first book, you find it raises a very interesting question now on how to read these particular texts. What is the first book? Geburt der Tragödie aus dem Geist der Musik. Everybody says, Nietzsche's first book is The Birth of Tragedy. Well, no, it's Geburt der Tragödie aus dem Geist der Musik, the spirit of music. What is the spirit of music? In 1870, when Nietzsche wrote that, there were 2 pieces of Greek music, count them 2, that had been recovered. Nobody knew what they sounded like. And yet Nietzsche claims to be able to understand Greek tragedy as born from the Geist der Musik. How could he do that? What's his proof for that? If we take this to be, as he says initially, and we were saying before, a wissenschaftlicher book by a man deeply trained in philology, which is not an easy science, if we take him to be doing that, how can he write a book claiming certain things about tragedy on the basis of non-existent evidence? Now, there's some interesting hints here or suggestions here that could be taken up and should be taken up, because we have another famous book which was written 30 years later called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Geist der Kapitalismus, by Max Weber. And when you look as to what Max Weber says about Geist, he says it's not an empirical concept, but es ist durchaus komponiert. It is composed. And I take that to be a kind of composed being a musical reference, because what is a composition? It's taking separate little elements and putting them together into something which gives a whole, and so forth. So how does Nietzsche manage to read The Birth of Tragedy, and what can be the justification or the proof, one might say, for his reading? To make the answer to the first part of that short, I think it goes something like this. Nietzsche actually thought he could read Greek so well that he heard it. Now, Ancient Greek is a particular language in the sense that it does not use stress ictus. I'm now using stress ictus. I am placing stress on certain words. Ancient Greek used pitch ictus, that instead of stressing particular syllables, you changed the pitch. You didn't change the stress. You changed the pitch, in fact, by as much as a fifth. And every particular word and sentence had changes in pitch. Hence, in some sense, Nietzsche thought or was convinced that his understanding of Greek, and he studies these questions of metrics and rhythms and rhythmics and so forth in his lectures very extensively. Again, very important, those lectures. He thought he understood Greek, could read Greek so well that he could actually hear it. I was delighted to find that there's a phrase in Rousseau, who also was very interested in similar questions about music and language, where Rousseau says, Les Grecs chantaient en parlant. The Greeks sang as they spoke. So Nietzsche, in reading the tragedies, essentially hears them. He hears the music. He hears them as music. This explains the particular passage which had always bothered me for a long time because I couldn't make any sense out of it until I finally worked through this question of music. And here I must say, with the help of Babette Babich, who's done very extensive work on this. In Zarathustra, you find a sentence towards the beginning, must one smash their ears before they learn to hear with their eyes? Was bedeutet das doch? What does that mean? Well, it means you have to hear with your eyes, and in fact, that is, you have to, in seeing the text, hear it. And I asked a composer friend of mine, Lou Spradlin, a wonderful composer, at one point, I said, look, Lou, when you pick up a score and read it and look at it, you hear it, right? And he said, of course, don't you? I said, no, I don't. I just see the notes. But, he sees it, he hears it with his eyes. And that's what Nietzsche thought he was doing when he was reading Sophocles or Aeschylus and so forth. And you can find actually a good deal of justification for this in ancient texts on prosody and so forth. Now, that leads to the second question, which is, how do you show this to other people? Because my Greek is nowhere, is nowhere as good as Nietzsche's and so forth. Nor is almost anybody's Greek today as good as that. Though there are some people, M.L. West and people like that, who have come pretty close. And this is what I think happens in The Birth of Tragedy, where he essentially is trying to make an appeal to one's experience in encountering, in this case, a work of art or encountering a text of some kind. I just wanted to read here a particular section. I may not desist, he says, from urging my friends to make another attempt and to consider a single example from our shared experience. I cannot appeal to those who use the images of events on stage and the words and passions of the dramatis personae in order thereby to get closer to a feeling for the music. For people like this do not have music as their mother tongue. Rather, I can only appeal to those who have a direct affinity with music, who relate to things almost exclusively through unconscious musical attempts. What he's saying there is, you have an experience of a particular work, and it doesn't even have to be a work of art. It could be it could be a public speech or something like that. You have an experience of it. Ask yourself, in fact, what exactly your experience is. Basically, what he's saying about tragedy here is, if you really opened yourself up and were honest about what you experienced in listening to tragedy, wouldn't you find the same thing in it that I find in it? Wouldn't you find the same thing that I have now set out in this 150-page book? That requires, however, that you not try to impose something on the work, that you not try to say what it actually means, but that you let it mean to you. This is why he's so opposed to Socrates and Euripides, because he thinks what Socrates does is Socrates says, well, why is that happening? Socrates goes to a play and wants to know, well, why is that going on? Well, if you do that, you will never be able to experience the play. If you go to a play, for instance, Othello, Shakespeare, and you say to yourself, why doesn't Othello just ask Desdemona about that goddamn handkerchief? They can get through this very quickly. It's not a big problem. Well, if you have that kind of distancing, criticizing understanding, you will, in fact, never experience the play. It will be nothing to you. So this is part of why Nietzsche is so concerned with the audience relationship to in The Birth of Tragedy, but it also relates back to the kind of relationship to a text which I tried to talk about earlier in this interview, as to allowing the text to be the analyst and yourself to be the analysand. And there's a slight desperation in those last 3, 4, 5 sections of Birth of Tragedy where he says, he has some sense people are just not going to get it. He says, friends, it's interesting, it's friends, try again. Don't you really feel it this way? Isn't this haven't I shown you or made available to you what your experiences are? And so forth. There's an interesting parallel here, which is with certain kinds of important variations. This is remarkably like the attitude towards Scripture which was held by early Protestants, which was you were not to interpret the Scripture, but you were to allow it to work upon you. You find that in Tyndale, you find that in Milton, you find that in a whole range of early Protestants and so forth, who are trying to get people to have a direct relationship with Scripture rather than an intermediary one that imposes something upon it. But you also find it in a wonderful phrase in Samuel Beckett, where he writes to his friend Alan Schneider, the great director, about the power of a text to claw and what's important about that. And that is really what Nietzsche, I think, is trying to make available to you. So there.